This is a brief history of printmaking, and one of the most important inventions of man is the printing press. It's a mechanized way to reproduce imagery and text that made ideas accessible to the masses. And just like the invention of the wheel, it played an important role in the progress of technology till today. So the two different types of printmaking in this class that we're going to be touching on is relief and intaglio, which is the oldest form of printmaking. And also there are the opposites of each other. So relief is the surface impression, and the intaglio is a type of printing process where the recessed portions are inked and impressed. So when I'm thinking about prints or reproduction, I think about where it was maybe first made. And I think about the cave paintings and the hand impressions and the stencils used to create an impression of man in these caves. And when you think about the chronology, humans were first discovered to make fire about 50,000 years ago, just kind of giving a timeline. And in Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization, which was developed around 10,000 BC. This is the area of the Fertile Crescent that is modern-day Egypt, Iraq, and Syria. This is where civilization just started to settle in, and where writing, agricultures, and cities evolved. When looking at that reproduction, or the idea of printmaking, there are these things called Sumerian cylinders, which was, in a way, reproducible, but its impressions were made onto clay as a personal signature. Here's another example of a Sumerian cylinder seal. So with civilization, there's like commerce. So the Silk trade routes from the 3rd to 15th century linked China to Europe. They trade luxury goods. So through trade, ideas and materials passed through. So some of the ideas were ideas of religion, and the ideas of printmaking spread with also the technology or invention of paper. And ideas or technologies also kind of like also gunpowder and the invention of the compass. So textiles or printing started with the printing or rubbing of imagery onto cloth or onto paper. So textiles were really the earliest form of printmaking. So it's a type of relief. And these ideas, again, traveled through the trade route. So ideas from China of printmaking spread through the Middle East to Europe from the trading routes. So that textile invention or the textile idea went to Europe about the 12th century. This is the Diamond Sutra, which is the oldest surviving completed book that was printed. That was discovered from this 1868 AD. And basically, the prints developed and spread with the idea of Buddhism in mind, spreading the word or the scripture of the Buddhist script. And this is an example of a relief print that's the oldest surviving woodblock, probably printed textile, probably made in the 13th century. And early woodblock prints were in Europe were to spread ideas of religion. So this one is also really early on prints were made with single sheets of wood. So this is a single block print on linen, so it's on fabric, and then hand colored. This is another example of early woodblock, religious in nature. And these things were easily carried to spread, the ideas of religion. And they're a lot cheaper than paintings and very portable. This is another one with a simple woodblock or woodcut that was hand colored. So with the invention or the idea of prints or the idea of print making traveled through Europe, and the person who invented the printing press was Johannes Gutenberg in Germany. Well, the printing press here he devised was this is a reproduction, but there's no evidence of the original printing press. But the idea was with the movable cast type. Oops, I didn't add the title, but this is Johannes Gutenberg, and he was really well known or famous for printing the Bible. So it was funded by Pope or the church, and maybe an estimate of 200 of these books were created. Maybe 22 exist today. But actually the original idea of the printing press was invented in the 11th century in China. And then the idea traveled to Korea, and they kind of refined the idea from cutting little type in wood into casted bronze or ceramic. So the problem with having these casted type or type in Chinese character is that there are maybe 40,000 or more separate characters. So it's very difficult to organize. So the benefit of having the casted type into a Latin language or alphabet is that it's a lot easier. There's fewer characters to create this book structure and recreate text. So after the invention of the press, intaglio was a little bit secondary. So the way that intaglio prints came about is from the Italian way of engraving onto armor. So designers or craftsmen would keep its detail of the engraved design on metal by putting ink or soot into the grooves of the engraved armor to keep a copy of their designs. So from that, you can see that the different types of intaglio prints are either scratching, which you'll do in your first project, just scratching a plastic plate. You see here is a type of or illustration of what is dry point, just scratching the plate. And so the difference of the engraving of the armor is that they use a different kind of tool to actually remove the material. So the bottom illustration is an engraving. A tool is actually physically removing the metal from the plate. And the dry point etching is just, traditionally was on metal. So when you're scratching onto a metal surface, the scratching is actually moving the material away. So you can see something called a burr. And that kind of creates this wispy nature of the dry point print versus a very clean engraved line that is removing the metal. And so this, again, this is Albrecht Dürer, who really mastered the art of engraving. So this is the second oldest type of printmaking, and very difficult to execute because it takes a lot of skill to carve away an image rather than like scratching a plate. So these are different tools. This is the tool that is different than your scribe. So these tools have a bent metal shaft with like a wooden handle that's like held in the palm of the hand, and the tool is pushed away from the body rather than held like a pencil to scratch a plate. And this is a different tool, different tools with different tips to create different looking angles. So again, the type of lines that create the dry point, it has a wispy kind of very dirty look because of the burr that's created on the metal plate. And you can see here the fuzziness of the beetle body and the fuzziness of the bush in the background. And Intaglio, as it was developing, realized that there are corrosive solvents or corrosive elements that can etch line and texture into the metal plate. So it can create tones like this. So it's not only line that you can create, it's value that you can create with pitting or modifying the surface of the plate so it will stay in the corrosive salt or the corrosive acid, and it eats it away. So this plate is this dark value in this plate is created because of the different types of pitting and resist materials that were used for this etching. So again, in this etching is with a chemical process. It's the middle illustration. So what is blocking the plate from the acid will hold its surface, and whatever is exposed to the solvent or the acid or this corrosive salt, there are different materials, will eat it away. And so this will be inked, wiped, and you can see that the ink that's left inside is going to hold the image. So if you see here, there's values that are very dark, and then there's light. But looking at the relief prints, there are different kinds of materials. There's wood, and then there's linoleum. So what you're going to be using is a type of new material that was created in 1600s for flooring and wall decoration. But as you can see here, this little relief plate is also printed in reverse. So you can see here that the process of relief is just like intaglio, except you ink the surface. No wiping away. But it is also, the image is in reverse. So here's another illustration of designs carved in on a wood block or linoleum plates. So you can see on the top illustration that the ink is only left on the surface of the paper. So the benefits of using linoleum is that it's softer than wood, and it's also less expensive. This is a detail of what you can get. This one is a 3x4 plate, but it won't hold as much detail as wood engravings. Here's another linoleum print, and you can see that it's very graphic. It's very graphic with negative and positive imagery. So there's no real middle tones that are created. It's just either inked or not inked. Areas are carved or not carved. Here's another one that's graphic. It's very negative and positive. I like to call it binary, right? There's no gray, but you can kind of create grays by mimicking hatch marks, by carving away lines like you see in the background here behind the man. There's a middle value rather than white or black. There's a texture that creates a middle value. And here you can see on this self-portrait that there is shadow and texture and a definition of a face from the texture or material left from the carving. Right? So there's the negative and the positive, and there's no gray value rather than just, it's just carved texture that's left on the plate. So here's another relief that's done in wood. So the difference between linoleum and woodcut is that you can have wood grain showing like here in the background. So that looks like a sheet of wood. So it's because it's inked and printed, and the texture of the wood is showing because the ink is not so opaque. So there's a little bit of translucency that is possible with the wood. Here's another one that is done on wood, but it could also be something similar to what you can do in a linoleum. I wanted to show you what the background, all that texture is. So that is called chatter. Chatter is kind of like a nickname for what this is so these are low, shallow cuts on the plate that kind of gets inky while you're inking it up with the brayer. So part of the background here, it has this texture that shows up because it catches the ink, but it's very loose and organic. But it's called chatter because it's supposed to be like disruptive, or if it's a solid image and it's not really meant to be in the design, it's described as chatter because it's kind of like it's disturbing the image, like people talking in the background is chatter that disturbs your concentration, right? So it's called chatter just because it is disturbing to an image. But here it works because it creates this texture or like a middle value because it catches the ink of the brayer and creates this sort of middle tone rather than the solid black that you see in the middle, like the man or the animal, that's solid black. And then there are this grayish looking shadows in the background because it isn't inked as solid because it's not as high as that solid area of the black. It's called chatter. So the benefit of using relief is that you can print really large. This is this is printed without using a press. So large prints like this must be hand printed, or there's a technique where you could roll, you could drive over the plate, but usually people are going to be hand printing this large scale print. Another way to think about adding color is this way Edvard Munch did with kind of like jigsawing. So you have a single sheet, or this is woodblock, so it's kind of sawn into like a jigsaw puzzle, and inked up in separate colors, and you can kind of create this multiple color print with using a single plate. And here is these are just examples of different styles that can be created with relief. And so this one is very organic and very large, a large scale relief in wood. Here's some more different styles that you can create. And here, rather than chatter creating a middle value, a lot of these lines create this middle tone. So there's black and white, and then there's a lot of texture that's created through the linear work of cutting the plate. And to expand on relief, relief is like how people call like its stamps, right? In a way, this is a relief print. It's a print created by stamping imagery onto a single sheet or a single image. So that is also a type of relief. If you want to take it to a different place, this is a Japanese style of a fish rubbing. So they'll ink this up with like kind of like an India ink, watercolor type of ink, and then blotted onto paper. So this is a Gotaku print. And later on in this semester, after you do after your first relief project, you'll understand how to create multiple color prints. So you can see here there are different colors. There's the line, and then there's the solid color. So you'll understand how to do that, and with things called registration. You have to have the plates, the two separate plates, exactly the same and aligned in the same area, so when you put the paper on, it'll catch in the same place. And here are some other ones that are relief prints that are made. These are not stamped, but carved on a single sheet. And some more imagery. You can see it's very solid, graphic in nature. There's just black and white. And I always have to throw this in here. This is a street artist, Swoon. She carves large wood blocks or wood sheets and hand prints these, cuts the imagery out, and then she wheat pastes these life-size figures on the street. So this is just a kind of a introduction to relief and the various ways people make relief prints.